What's up, guys? I'm Kay Scholl. Welcome to another financial awareness video. So today we're talking about Ray Dalio's book, Principles. If you don't have the time or the energy or the desire to read a 544-page book, this video is for you. I spend about 15 minutes every morning reading as a part of my morning routine, and over the course of the last 4 or 5 months, I started and finished this book cover to cover. So if you're looking for the Cliff Notes version with some of my favorite quotes from the book, this video is for you. Kurt, you can go ahead and put the phone down in the cup holder if you're driving to work. This will be a good listen. As of right now in 2020, Ray Dalio is 71 years old and has a net worth of $16.9 billion.
Go to Google for the information. I'm a superstar, so I gotta shine.
Which is more than Carl Icahn and about 10 times more than Jamie Dimon, which is only to put this into perspective of how much Ray's been able to accomplish. His company Bridgewater and Associates has around $138 billion of assets under management. Ray Dalio is not a financial advisor that's going to call you up to see if you need any help with your Roth IRA, but rather he's the one that would manage the pension fund for the state or the city that you might have worked in. If you have any good suggestions of books you're reading or have read, let me know in the comments below. The book is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is titled Where I'm Coming From, which is a really nice 131-page introduction to his personal life and how he started Bridgewater. Ray's been married to his wife, Barbara, for over 4 decades, and they have 4 sons together. Part 2 is titled Life Principles, and Part 3 is titled Work Principles. And I'm just going to cherry pick some of my favorite quotes from each of those parts. So who is Ray Dalio? Ray Dalio, who grew up a very ordinary middle-class kid from Long Island, started the investment company Bridgewater Associates out of his 2-bedroom apartment when he was 26 years old and built it over the next 42 years into what Fortune magazine assessed to be the 5th most important private company in the United States. He did that by creating a unique culture, an idea meritocracy based on radical truth, radical transparency, and believability-weighted decision-making that he believes most people and organizations can use to better achieve their own goals. Along the way, Dalio became one of the 100 most influential and 100 wealthiest people in the world. And because his unique investment principles changed the industry, CIO magazine called him the Steve Jobs of investing. He believes that his success isn't due to anything special about him. It is the result of principles he learned largely by making mistakes from which he also believes most people can benefit. Here are my favorite quotes. The most painful lesson that was repeatedly hammered home is that you can never be sure of anything. There are always risks out there that can hurt you badly, even in the seemingly safest bets. So it's always best to assume you're missing something. I learned a great fear of being wrong that shifted my mindset from thinking I'm right to asking myself, how do I know I'm right? And I saw clearly that the best way to answer this question is by finding other independent thinkers who are on the same mission as me and who see things differently from me. By engaging them in thoughtful disagreement, I'd be able to understand their reasoning and have them stress test mine. That way, we can all raise our probability of being right. In other words, I just want to be right. I don't care if the right answer comes from me. What I really love about this quote and what I took away from this part of the book is that he just wants to be right. And he doesn't care if you're right or if he's right. He wants to stress test why he thinks he's right or stress test why you think you're right so that both of you can be right together and increase your probability that both of you are right. Between 1979 and 1982, I had eaten enough glass to realize what was most important wasn't knowing the future, it was knowing how to react appropriately to the information available at each point in time. What you and I can take away from this quote is that we don't have to have a crystal ball, but we do have to have a plan of how we're going to react and how we're going to adapt as changes occur. For example, as your income fluctuates, how are you going to change your investment strategy? As your risk tolerance changes, how are you going to adjust your investment decisions? As your retirement goals change, as you maybe arrive to retirement, how are you going to adapt your financial planning once you actually get there? And how can you give yourself options along the way so that in the event there are changes, you could have some flexibility in which account you pull from first? These are all random examples of how we can learn from this example from the book. The success of this approach taught me a principle that I apply to all parts of my life. Making a handful of good, uncorrelated bets that are balanced and leveraged well is the surest way of having a lot of upside without being exposed to unacceptable downside. What I'm taking away from this quote is you don't have to be right in every single asset class, but if you have a diversified portfolio and you're taking the appropriate amount of risk in each asset class that you feel comfortable with, you don't have to have all winners. But if you add all of those asset classes up within your portfolio or within your overall portfolio, you should have a lot more gainers and you can hedge any losers. Having a process that ensures problems are brought to the surface and their root causes diagnosed assures that continual improvements occur. What I'm taking away from this is that you should have a process of how to deal with mistakes. You should write it down, think about it, diagnose it, get to the root cause, and then continuously try to improve. To me, the greatest success you can have as the person in charge is to orchestrate others to do things well without you. A step below that is doing things well yourself, and worst of all is doing things poorly yourself. This is a quote where he talks about other leaders around the globe, which he calls shapers. They are extremely resilient because their need to achieve what they envision is stronger than the pain they experience as they struggle to achieve it. Think about that for a minute. Certain leaders, certain shapers have a desire to accomplish their goal, and their personal pain that they experience is not the number one priority, but rather a subset priority. When faced with a choice between achieving their goal or pleasing or not disappointing others, they would choose achieving their goal every time. Again, talking about leaders, real leaders, and shapers, they put the goal ahead of their personal agenda. Ray has traveled the entire world and has been to many countries and spoken with the highest leaders of those countries. So this is a good one because it's a little political and you know it's coming from the truth. From my contacts with policymakers in a number of countries, I learned quite a bit about how international relations really works. It is quite different from what most people imagine. Countries behave in a more self-interested and less considerate way than what most of us would consider appropriate for individuals. When countries negotiate with one another, they typically operate as if they are opponents in a chess match or merchants in a bazaar, in which maximizing one's own benefit is the sole objective. Smart leaders know their own country's vulnerabilities, take advantage of others' vulnerabilities, and expect the other country's leaders to do the same. Most people who haven't had direct contact with the leadership of their own and other countries form their views based on what they learn in the media and become quite naive to inappropriately opinionated as a result. So what he's basically saying is what we're fed in the news media is not reality, but I think a lot of us already knew that. And what he is saying is that a lot of countries and leaders of other countries act in those countries' self-interest normally. Unfortunately, most policymakers enter their careers as idealists and leave disillusioned. Oh, that's good. I realize that the satisfaction of success doesn't come from achieving your goals, but from struggling well. This is on page 122, and this is when I really started to get engaged in the book and was excited to read it every day, because he really goes into depth about talking about how the struggle and the process is more important than the results. And he talks a lot here going forward about how there's a lot of value in the struggle and not as much value in the prize. While I experienced them going from the bottom up rather from the top down, my assessment is that the incremental benefits of having a lot and being on top are not nearly as great as most people think. What I'm taking away from that is that he made a lot of money and has been able to do a lot with his money and provide for his family, but being number one or being really wealthy isn't really as great as people make it out to be. Within part 2, there are 5 life principles that he dives deeper into. Number 1, embrace reality and deal with it. Number 2, use the 5-step process to get what you want out of life. Number 3, be radically open-minded. Number 4, understand that people are wired very differently. Number 5, learn how to make decisions effectively. Embrace reality and deal with it. Yes. If I can reconcile my emotions with my logic and only act when they are aligned, I make better decisions. Emotion and logic. We're moving now. Pain plus reflection equals progress. If you can develop a reflexive reaction to psychic pain that causes you to reflect rather than avoid it, it will lead to your rapid learning and evolving. What this means is that you have to make an intentional practice. When you hear something or when you see something, try not to react emotionally. Try to develop your reaction to certain situations. If you're not failing, you're not pushing your limits. And if you're not pushing your limits, you're not maximizing your potential. This is a great quote, one of my favorite quotes from the whole book, because if you're not actively trying to further yourself, if you're not actively trying to make yourself into a better person, if you're not pushing your limits, what are you doing? This is another good one. Embrace tough love. In my own life, what I want to give to people, most importantly to the people I love, is the power to deal with reality to get what they want. In pursuit of my goal to give them strength, I will often deny them what they want because that will give them the opportunity to struggle so that they can develop the strength to get what they want on their own. This can be difficult for people emotionally, even if they understand intellectually that having difficulties is the exercise they need to grow strong, and that just giving them what they want will weaken them and ultimately lead to them needing more help. What a great quote. One of my favorite quotes, very similar to this, is the most expensive gift to receive and to give is honesty. And we can relate this with our own financial planning, with our own investments, with our own lives. For example, a lot of parents want to save as much money as possible for their kids' college fund or for their kids' future. But what you really need to understand is that when you tell your kid no, or when you force your child to, work a little harder at something, whether that's their job or homework or life, although you maybe can afford to give them what they want, if you deny them that gift and instead you give them the opportunity to struggle, they will learn, they will struggle, and they will become better people as a result. One of my favorite quotes of the book. Okay, 2 things here. In order to have the best life possible, you have to 1, know what the best decisions are, and 2, have the courage to make them. The main test of a great partnership is not whether the parties ever disagree. People in all healthy relationships disagree, but whether they can bring their disagreements to the surface and get through them well. Having clear processes for resolving disagreements efficiently and clearly is essential for business partnerships, marriage, and all other forms of partnership. This actually is a little bit personal, but this is a great quote of how I started to fall in love with my wife back when we were dating. We actually were at a party and I was very immature and I did something inappropriate. I kind of lashed out a little bit at somebody else at the party and she was incredibly embarrassed. And she brought that to my attention on the way home from the party. And as she ended that conversation, she said, okay, what can I do to prevent you from feeling that way again? And what I learned at that very moment was that we fought very well. She pointed out something for me, but then she, with some humility, she said, what can I do to help prevent that situation again? And I knew at that moment, this was a good chick. I don't know why I said that. Putting comfort ahead of success produces worse results for everyone. So some of these quotes are now part of part 3, which is work principles. You have to work in a culture that suits you, that's fundamental to your happiness and your effectiveness. You also must work in a culture that is effective in producing great outcomes, because if you don't, you won't get the psychic and material rewards that keep you motivated. So if you don't like where you work, maybe move. Have integrity and demand it from others. Thinking solely about what's accurate instead of how it's perceived pushes you to focus on the most important things. So don't be afraid to give somebody else credit. A lot of times, if you were the one to actually be the boss in charge or be the one delivering the presentation, don't be afraid to give credit where credit is due. Be open, be honest, and do that. Make sure that people understand the difference between fairness and generosity. Generosity is good and entitlement is bad, and they can easily be confused. So be crystal clear on which is which. Create a culture in which it is okay to make mistakes and unacceptable not to learn from them. It seems to me that if you look back on yourself a year ago and aren't shocked by how stupid you were, you haven't learned much. This gets back to something as simple as this: reading a book. How often do you read? What books do you read? Who do you surround yourself with? How are you challenging yourself? If you're not smarter than who you were a year ago, you need to look in the mirror. Recognize that mistakes are a natural part of the evolutionary process. If you don't mind being wrong on the way to being right, you'll learn a lot and increase your effectiveness. Making mistakes is normal. I mentioned this in a podcast I was on a few weeks ago. Mistakes are good because they give you the opportunity to learn and get better. What's bad is when you make mistakes and don't learn from them. Find the most believable people possible who disagree with you and try to understand their reasoning. I do this a lot with the media. I know we talked about TV and the news media a minute ago. I know what my core values are, and I know where I stand politically. So in a way to further my knowledge, I like to watch other news channels because I know where I stand on certain points and certain political things. So I like to learn how other people that think differently from me are talking about the same story. Remember that in great partnerships, consideration and generosity are more important than money. Remember that the only purpose of money is to get what you want. So think hard about what you value and put that above money. That's self-explanatory. Recognize that tough love is both the hardest and most important type of love to give because it is so rarely welcomed. I just said this a minute ago. The greatest gift you can give someone is the power to be successful. Giving people the opportunity to struggle rather than giving them the things they are struggling for will make them stronger. Knowing how people operate and being able to judge whether that way of operating will lead to good results is more important than knowing what they did. Knowing what people are like is the best indicator of how well they are likely to handle their responsibilities in the future. At Bridgewater, we call this paying more attention to the swing than the shot. Since good and bad outcomes can arise from circumstances that might not have had anything to do with how the individual handled the situation, it is preferable to assess people based on both their reasoning and their outcomes. What I really like about this quote, the quote is paying more attention to the swing than the shot, is even if you take a swing and miss, if you can logically defend and logically argue how you took the swing and why you took the swing, that could be just as important, if not more important, than whether or not you hit the ball. Think like an owner and expect the people you work with to do the same. It's a basic reality that if you don't experience the consequences of your actions, you'll take less ownership of them. If you are an employee and you get a paycheck for turning up and pleasing your boss, your mindset will inevitably be trained to this cause-effect relationship. If you are a manager, make sure you structure incentives and penalties that encourage people to take full ownership of what they do and not just coast by. Again, what I really like about what he's saying here is own up to yourself, own up to your decisions. After conferring with some of the world's greatest experts on governance, we put a new system in place based on these principles. Still, I want to make clear that I don't consider myself an expert on governance and can't vouch for the following principles as much as I can vouch for the various previous ones because they are still new as of this writing. Basically, what I really like from this quote is that he's admitting that although he's sharing some of his principles, he hasn't tested them. So he's setting our expectations very well because a lot of these other principles in the book are principles that he has acted on and put into place and has proof behind them. But some of these new ones, he hasn't had enough time to test them. So I really like how he's admitting where he's good and also admitting where he's maybe not as good. Even though these principles probably are good that he's talking about in this quote, I still like the fact that he's doing this. Question for you. Let me know in the comments below, how often do you read, or what are some good books that you're reading right now? I appreciate your time. See you in the next one.